When you wake up, there is a very precise inner sensation that announces it. It is not triumph, it is not anger, it is not even relief. It is the sudden failure of an old pressure that once governed your movements without ever speaking its name. Guilt stops working, and in that quiet collapse, something far more unsettling happens. The entire architecture of control that surrounded you begins to dissolve, not because you fought it, but because it no longer has a psychological organ through which it can reach you. I want you to understand this carefully, because the modern mind misunderstands awakening as a moral improvement or an ethical purification. That is a dangerous fantasy. Awakening is not about becoming better. It is about becoming inaccessible to certain mechanisms that once shaped you from the inside. Guilt is one of the most ancient of these mechanisms. It is older than religion, older than law, older than culture. Guilt is not taught first through words, it is taught through atmosphere, through looks, through silence, through withdrawal of love, through the subtle message that says, your being creates disturbance unless you manage it for others. From childhood onward, guilt becomes the invisible hand that steers behavior long before conscious intention forms. The child does not yet have a stable ego. It has no differentiated center, so it learns to regulate itself according to the emotional climate of those it depends upon. If the mother grows cold when the child asserts itself, the child learns that selfhood carries danger. If the father withdraws approval when the child disobeys, the child learns that obedience is the currency of belonging. Guilt emerges not as a moral insight, but as a survival adaptation. It is the psyche's way of saying, remain connected at all costs. Over time, this adaptation crystallizes into an inner voice, but you must not confuse this voice with conscience. Conscience, properly understood, arises from the self, from an inner ethical necessity that feels aligned, firm, and strangely calm. Guilt, by contrast, is noisy, it is anxious, it is urgent. It does not ask you to act in truth. It asks you to restore emotional equilibrium in the environment, often at the cost of your own psychic integrity. Guilt does not care whether something is right, it only cares whether tension is reduced. Now, consider what this means for systems of control. Any system that relies on guilt does not need force. It does not need violence. It does not even need surveillance. The individual becomes the enforcer. The individual anticipates disapproval before it arrives. The individual corrects themselves before anyone else must intervene. This is why guilt is such a prized psychological instrument in families, institutions, and intimate relationships. It creates obedience without visible chains. But guilt has one fatal weakness. It requires unconsciousness. It only works as long as the individual does not see it operating. The moment you become aware of guilt as a mechanism rather than a truth, its power begins to leak away. Not dramatically at first, not in some heroic rebellion, but subtly, like air escaping from a sealed chamber. Awakening, then, is not the destruction of guilt. It is the realization that guilt is not synonymous with truth. That realization alone is enough to destabilize entire relational structures, because once guilt stops working, control collapses, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. You may notice this first in your body. The old reflex to explain yourself weakens. The compulsion to justify your needs loses urgency. You begin to feel an unfamiliar pause where once there was immediate self-correction. Others sense this before you articulate it. They feel a gap, a delay, a silence where compliance used to live. And silence, psychologically speaking, is intolerable to those who rely on predictable emotional responses. At this stage, many people become frightened and attempt to reattach guilt by moralizing their awakening. They ask themselves, am I becoming selfish? Am I cold? Am I abandoning others? These questions are themselves the last defense of the old system. Guilt disguises itself as virtue in order to survive. It tells you that to be free is to be cruel, that to be whole is to be unloving, that to be autonomous is to be dangerous. But I want you to listen very closely now. There is a profound difference between cruelty and non-participation. There is a difference between abandonment and withdrawal. There is a difference between selfishness and self-possession. The unconscious does not make these distinctions. That is why awakening feels destabilizing. You are learning to perceive psychological reality with a level of nuance that the old emotional economy cannot tolerate. In analytical psychology, we speak of the shadow not as evil, but as a sum of what consciousness has rejected. In many individuals, especially those trained early to be good, helpful, understanding, or accommodating, the shadow contains not aggression or malice, but sovereignty, the ability to say no without explanation, the capacity to disappoint without collapsing, the strength to let others feel the consequences of their own emotional immaturity. When this shadow material begins to integrate, guilt loses its authority, not because you decide to stop feeling it, but because it no longer aligns with your lived experience of reality. You begin to notice that the catastrophe guilt predicted does not arrive. The world does not end when you refuse. Love does not vanish when you withdraw from manipulation. Meaning does not collapse when you stop rescuing others from themselves. This is the moment control collapses externally, but it collapses because it already collapsed internally. Those around you may react with confusion, anger, moral outrage, or sudden vulnerability. Some will accuse you of changing. They are correct, but not in the way they think. You have not changed your values. You have changed your center of gravity. You are no longer orbiting their emotional needs as your primary axis of meaning. You are no longer negotiating your existence through their approval. This shift is deeply threatening to unconscious systems because guilt-based control only functions when the individual feels responsible for emotions that are not theirs to carry. When you return responsibility to its rightful owner, the entire system experiences anxiety, not because you are doing something wrong, but because the old pattern has lost its regulator. At this stage, dreams often intensify. You may dream of locked rooms opening, of animals no longer caged, of leaving familiar houses and walking into unknown landscapes. These are not metaphors invented by the mind. They are symbolic representations of psychic energy redistributing itself. The libido that was once bound in appeasement, vigilance, and emotional labor is being freed, and free energy always seeks new form. This is where many retreat, because freedom is not immediately comforting. Guilt, for all its suffering. Provided orientation, it told you who you were by telling you what you owed. When that voice falls silent, there is a temporary disorientation. You may feel empty, flat, unmoored. This is not pathology, it is the psyche recalibrating itself around a deeper center. The self, in Jungian terms, is not a moral authority. It is a totality. It includes light and shadow, order and chaos, attachment and separation. When the ego begins to align with the self rather than with external emotional economies, guilt can no longer serve as a guide. Something quieter takes its place, a sense of inner rightness that does not argue, does not plead, does not demand permission. And this is perhaps the most unsettling change for those around you. You no longer defend your boundaries with emotion. You do not justify them with narratives. You simply inhabit them. This feels cold to those who depended on your emotional permeability. But coldness is not the absence of feeling. It is the absence of entanglement. When guilt stops working, manipulation becomes visible. Emotional hooks lose their grip. Appeals that once pierced you now pass through without lodging. This is not because you have hardened your heart. It is because your heart is no longer available as a control surface. In the next movement of this process, something even deeper begins to surface. Something that has been waiting beneath guilt all along. It is the question of identity itself, not who you are to others, but who you are when no one is managing you from the inside. And this question does not announce itself gently. It arrives with a kind of existential gravity that demands your full attention. Because once guilt has fallen away, there is no longer anything to hide behind. When guilt releases its grip, the psyche does not rush forward into clarity. It pauses, and that pause is often mistaken for emptiness, or worse, for moral decay. But what you are encountering in that interval is something far older and far more real than the roles you have lived inside. You are encountering psychic space, and space, for a consciousness accustomed to constant inner pressure, feels terrifying. For years, perhaps for decades, your inner life was crowded with expectations, anticipations, rehearsals of other people's reactions. You learn to think 3 steps ahead emotionally, to preempt disappointment, to soften your edges before they could wound anyone else. Guilt trained you to remain occupied. It filled silence with obligation. It transformed stillness into anxiety. So when guilt collapses, silence returns. Not the comfortable silence of rest, but the charged silence of something unoccupied for the first time. In that silence, the ego loses its old reference points. It can no longer ask, "What do they need from me?" or "How do I prevent disapproval?" Those questions once structured your sense of self. They gave you direction, even if that direction led away from your own center. Without them, a deeper question begins to rise. One the psyche has postponed for as long as possible. If I am not needed, not approved of, not useful, then who am I? This question is not philosophical. It is visceral. It can produce dizziness, fatigue, even a sense of depersonalization. Many mistake this phase for regression or depression, but analytically, it is a withdrawal of psychic projection. You are reclaiming energy that was scattered outward, bound up in managing others' inner worlds. That energy does not immediately become joy or creativity. First, it becomes unclaimed, and unclaimed energy destabilizes the ego. Here is where the old control systems attempt one final maneuver. Guilt returns disguised as responsibility. It tells you that your withdrawal is causing harm, that your silence is violence, that your absence is abandonment. But notice something subtle. These accusations no longer land in the same place. They echo rather than penetrate. You feel them, perhaps, but they do not compel you. They circle the perimeter of your psyche, searching for an opening that is no longer there. This is because guilt always depended on your identification with an assigned role: the good child, the reliable one, the emotional anchor, the one who understands, the one who absorbs. These roles were never neutral. They were psychic contracts, often formed unconsciously, that exchanged belonging for self-erasure. When you awaken, you do not tear up these contracts dramatically. You simply stop honoring them, and contracts that are not honored quietly expire. At this point, others may escalate, not necessarily through overt aggression, but through regression. They may become helpless, confused, wounded. They may suddenly need you more than ever. This is not coincidence. It is the unconscious testing whether guilt can still be reactivated through compassion. This is one of the most difficult thresholds, because compassion itself is not the problem. The problem is fusion. Compassion without boundaries becomes control's most elegant disguise. You are asked now to discover a form of care that does not require self-sacrifice, a way of loving that does not involve disappearance. This is not something the ego knows how to do immediately. It must be learned through failure, through discomfort, through tolerating the distress of others without rushing to dissolve it. This tolerance feels cruel at first, but it is not cruelty. It is differentiation. Differentiation is the capacity to remain psychologically separate while emotionally present. Most people never develop it. They confuse emotional resonance with responsibility. They believe that feeling another's pain obligates them to fix it. Guilt thrives in this confusion. Awakening dissolves it. As differentiation grows, something unexpected occurs. You begin to perceive manipulation not as malice, but as immaturity. You see how others learn to regulate their anxiety through you. You see how your predictability provided stability for systems that could not stabilize themselves. This perception is sobering. It removes the drama from the narrative. There are no villains here, only unconscious strategies colliding with consciousness. This is where the shadow deepens, not because darker impulses emerge, but because clarity does. You may notice anger surfacing, not explosive rage, but a cold, lucid anger that simply observes. This anger is not reactive. It does not seek expression. It seeks truth. It says, something in this dynamic was false. Something in my compliance was a betrayal of the self. This anger often carries guilt with it at first. You may feel ashamed for noticing it, ashamed for not feeling endlessly understanding. But anger, when it emerges at this stage, is not the opposite of love. It is the boundary of love. It marks where you end and another begins. It is the psyche's way of restoring shape after years of diffusion. Dreams may now turn darker. You may dream of confrontations, of standing your ground, of watching others collapse when you do not intervene. These dreams are not predictions, they are rehearsals. The unconscious is preparing you for the emotional reality of no longer rescuing others from their own instability. Here is a truth rarely spoken. When guilt stops working, some relationships cannot survive, not because you have failed them, but because they were never built on mutual presence. They were built on your availability. Control collapses, and with it, the illusion of reciprocity. This loss can feel profound. You may grieve not the person, but the fantasy of being needed. Being needed once gave you meaning. It gave you identity, but it was a borrowed meaning, contingent upon your continued diminishment. As it dissolves, a more difficult task begins: the construction of meaning that does not depend on usefulness. This is where individuation truly starts, not when you discover your talents, not when you heal your wounds, but when you tolerate being unneeded without collapsing into worthlessness. This tolerance is rare. It requires you to stand in your own psychic weight without external validation. It requires you to feel real without reflection. At this stage, control no longer collapses only around you, it collapses within you. The internalized authorities, the voices that once told you who to be, lose coherence. You may notice a strange neutrality emerging, not apathy, but a lack of compulsion. You no longer rush toward approval or flee from disapproval. You begin to inhabit a third position, one that observes rather than reacts. This position is often misunderstood as detachment, but it is not detachment from life. It is detachment from unconscious participation. You are still present, you still feel, but you are no longer absorbed. And now, a deeper question approaches, one that cannot be avoided once guilt has fallen silent and control has lost its grip. If you are no longer governed by fear of disapproval, what governs you now? What principle replaces guilt? What inner authority speaks when the old one goes quiet? This question does not admit an immediate answer. It must be lived into, and what emerges next is not comfort, but something far more demanding: a confrontation with your own will, stripped of excuses, stripped of moral camouflage, stripped of the roles that once explained you away. When the old authorities fall silent, you may expect to hear a new voice arrive immediately, clear and commanding, to replace them. But this expectation itself belongs to the old order. It assumes that life must be governed from above, that direction must come as instruction, that legitimacy requires an external seal. What actually emerges is far more unsettling. There is no voice at first. There is presence. This presence does not persuade, it does not argue, it does not reassure you with reasons. It simply is. And because it does not flatter the ego often resists it. The ego wants rules. It wants certainty. It wants permission to exist without guilt. But the self does not grant permission. It assumes existence. You begin to notice this presence most clearly in moments when you are no longer performing, when you are not explaining yourself, when you are not managing the emotional temperature of the room. There is a quiet density to these moments, as if something in you has weight for the first time. You are no longer floating between demands, you are standing somewhere. This is where will enters, not will as ambition, not will as domination, but will as orientation. The will that emerges after guilt collapses is not aggressive. It does not push outward, it pulls inward. It asks you to align your actions with an inner necessity that does not require applause. This kind of will feels impersonal, even strange. It may direct you away from things you once believed were essential. It may withdraw energy from relationships, careers, or identities that once defined you, not because they are immoral, but because they are no longer true. This is the point at which many people panic and attempt to resurrect guilt by spiritualizing it. They tell themselves they must remain humble, must remain selfless, must remain accessible. But humility that denies inner truth is not humility. It is fear disguised as virtue. The self does not humiliate the ego, but it does relativize it. It reminds the ego that it is not the center, but it does not ask the ego to disappear. As this relativization deepens, you may notice a profound shift in how you experience choice. Previously, choices were weighed against anticipated reactions. You chose what minimized guilt, what preserved harmony, what maintained your position within a system. Now choices arise differently. They are accompanied by a bodily resonance, a sense of inner alignment or misalignment that precedes rational thought. When you ignore this resonance, you feel depleted. When you follow it, even into uncertainty, you feel strangely intact. This is not intuition in the popular sense. It is not a psychic flash or a mystical whisper. It is a somatic truth, a coherence between inner structure and outer action. Guilt once overrode this coherence by privileging external equilibrium over internal order. Now the hierarchy has reversed. Those around you may experience this reversal as unpredictability. They can no longer anticipate your responses. You no longer behave according to the old script. This unpredictability is deeply destabilizing to systems of control. Control depends on pattern. When pattern dissolves, anxiety rises. Others may attempt to restore predictability by provoking you emotionally, by testing boundaries, by appealing to your past identity. These attempts may even succeed momentarily. Awakening is not linear, but something has changed irreversibly. You notice the manipulation as it happens, and noticing is enough to prevent possession. At this stage, the archetype of the scapegoat often surfaces. Many who awaken from guilt-based control were unconsciously carrying collective tensions. They absorbed conflict, diffused aggression, maintained peace by suffering quietly. When they withdraw from this role, the collective discomfort becomes visible. Others may unconsciously attempt to push you back into the position of carrier. They may accuse you of selfishness, coldness, even cruelty. But scapegoating only works when the carrier accepts the burden. When you refuse, the shadow returns to its rightful owners. This return is rarely graceful. It may involve rupture, distance, silence, loss, but these are not failures of awakening. They are consequences of differentiation. A system that relied on your unconscious participation cannot survive your consciousness intact. Here the psyche enters a mourning phase. You grieve not only relationships, but versions of yourself. You grieve the self who believed that love required exhaustion, that belonging required contraction, that safety required invisibility. This grief is deep and often wordless. It moves through the body more than the mind. It may surface as fatigue, tears without narrative, a sense of mourning, something you cannot name. Do not rush this grief. It is the psyche releasing an identity that was never fully yours. And release always precedes reorganization. As the grief settles, something unexpected may appear: joy, not exuberant joy, not happiness as stimulation, but a quiet pleasure in being, a pleasure in not being pulled, in not being needed, in not being explained. This joy is subtle and easily overlooked because it does not announce itself dramatically, but it carries a sense of rightness that guilt never provided. You may also notice that your relationship to time changes. Urgency decreases. The compulsion to respond immediately weakens. You take longer pauses before speaking. You allow questions to remain unanswered. This temporal shift is not laziness. It is sovereignty. Guilt thrives on urgency. It demands immediate resolution. When urgency dissolves, so does its leverage. In dreams, this often appears as standing still while others rush, or watching storms from a place of shelter, or refusing to enter familiar buildings. These images reflect an inner stillness that does not depend on control. You are no longer trying to stabilize the outer world through inner sacrifice. You are allowing reality to unfold without interference. This is where the concept of responsibility must be re-examined. Responsibility, in its mature form, does not mean carrying what is not yours. It means responding from your center rather than reacting from fear. You may still help, you may still care, but you no longer disappear into service. Your actions come from choice, not compulsion. Here, the shadow integrates further. You may discover capacities you once disowned: firmness, decisiveness, even indifference. Indifference, in this context, is not apathy. It is the refusal to be psychologically hijacked. It is the ability to let others have their emotions without assuming responsibility for them. As this capacity stabilizes, control collapses at a deeper level. Not only external control, but internalized control. You no longer police your own thoughts and feelings to maintain an image. You allow contradictions, ambivalence, complexity. You become less legible to others, but more coherent to yourself. This coherence does not make you superior. It makes you solitary in a new way, not isolated, but individuated. You stand in relation rather than in fusion. You meet others as separate centers rather than as extensions of a shared emotional field. And now, a final and more dangerous temptation appears. The temptation to identify with awakening itself, to make non-guilt, non-reactivity, non-attachment into a new identity. This is subtle. The ego is clever. It will attempt to claim sovereignty as an achievement, but the self does not belong to the ego. The moment you weaponize your awakening, you fall back into control, merely inverted. True awakening remains humble, not in posture, but in structure. It does not announce itself. It does not require recognition. It continues to listen inwardly even as it acts decisively outwardly. At this depth, you realize something that changes everything. Guilt was never the voice of morality. It was the voice of fear. And when fear no longer governs, ethics do not disappear. They deepen. They become rooted in truth rather than compliance. What emerges next is not a new rule book. but a new relationship to power itself. Not power over others, but power to remain oneself in the presence of others. This power is quiet. It does not seek confirmation, but it reshapes every encounter, every choice, every silence. And as this power settles, one final realization begins to form, not as a thought, but as a lived certainty. Control collapses not because you resist it, but because there is nothing left in you that responds to it. When nothing in you responds to control, the world does not become gentler, it becomes clearer. The illusions that once softened reality fall away, and what remains is not cruelty, but precision. You begin to see how much of what passed for love was negotiation, how much of what passed for morality was fear management, how much of what passed for connection was sustained by unspoken leverage. This seeing is not cynical, it is surgical, and surgery, while necessary, is never sentimental. At this stage, a strange inversion occurs. Those who once appeared powerful now seem fragile, not because they are weak, but because their strength depended on unconscious cooperation. They required your guilt to regulate themselves. Without it, their inner instability is exposed. You may feel compassion here, but it is a different kind of compassion, one that does not rush forward, does not intrude, does not rescue. It simply recognizes. Recognition, when unaccompanied by intervention, can feel like abandonment to those who were never taught to stand alone. This is where the deepest misunderstanding arises. Many believe that awakening produces distance because the awakened person withdraws. In truth, distance appears because others cannot approach without manipulation. When the old emotional currencies no longer function, genuine meeting becomes possible, but only for those willing to meet without advantage. Some cannot, and so separation occurs, not as punishment, but as consequence. Here, the archetype of the hermit often constellates, not as isolation, but as inward anchoring. The hermit does not flee the world, he carries the world lightly. He walks among others without needing to be seen, approved, or affirmed. His lantern does not illuminate others by force. It illuminates the ground beneath his own feet. Those who are ready may follow. Those who are not will turn away, unsettled by the absence of invitation. Your speech changes now. You say less, but each word carries weight. You no longer speak to convince. You speak to express alignment. Silence becomes an active presence rather than a void. In conversations, you may notice that others project into your quiet. They fill the space with their assumptions, fears, or desires. This projection reveals more than any explanation ever could. You learn that clarity does not always require articulation. At this depth, dreams may shift again. You may dream of standing on high ground, not above others, but apart, or of being unseen, yet unthreatened, or of watching familiar dramas from a distance without urgency to intervene. These images reflect a psyche that has reclaimed its center. The ego no longer rushes to dissolve tension. It allows tension to exist without identifying with it. This allowing marks the final collapse of guilt as a governing force. Guilt cannot survive where tension is tolerated. It feeds on urgency, on the belief that discomfort must be immediately resolved. When you learn to let discomfort breathe, guilt suffocates, and with it, the subtle compulsion to manage others' inner worlds. What replaces guilt is not indifference, but conscience in its truest form. Conscience here is not a list of rules. It is an inner alignment that resists distortion. You feel when something violates your integrity, and you move away without drama. You feel when something resonates, and you move toward it without justification. This movement is quiet, but it is firm. Power, in this state, is no longer something you wield. It is something you embody. Others feel it not because you assert it, but because you do not surrender it. You are not impressive. You are ungraspable. Control cannot operate where there is nothing to hook into. This ungraspability often provokes one last attempt from the old system, moral inversion. You may be framed as cold, arrogant, or uncaring, but notice something crucial. These judgments no longer destabilize you. They pass through like weather, not because you are superior, but because your sense of self is no longer located in reflection. You do not discover who you are by how others see you. Here, the psyche reaches a paradoxical state. You are more open, yet less accessible, more compassionate, yet less entangled, more present, yet less reactive. This paradox cannot be resolved intellectually. It must be lived. The ego, now properly situated, becomes a servant rather than a ruler. It organizes, acts, decides, but it does not dominate. The self remains the quiet center around which life arranges itself. This arrangement does not guarantee happiness. It guarantees coherence. And coherence, in psychological terms, is the deepest form of peace. You may still feel loneliness at times. Individuation is not a collective project, but this loneliness is not abandonment. It is the space required for truth. In that space, you discover that your worth was never conditional, never earned, never dependent on guilt. It was intrinsic, but obscured by adaptation. As this realization stabilizes, you move through the world differently. You are no longer compelled to correct, rescue, or explain. You respond when response is called for. You withdraw when withdrawal is necessary. Your actions are no longer attempts to secure belonging. They are expressions of being. And this is the final understanding. Guilt once told you that you existed in debt. Awakening reveals that you exist in relation, but not in obligation. Relation can be chosen. Obligation enslaves. When obligation dissolves, love is no longer coerced. It becomes free or it disappears. Control collapses here, not with noise, but with irrelevance. It has nothing left to command, nothing left to threaten, nothing left to manipulate. You have not become unreachable because you built walls. You have become unreachable because there is no longer a door that opens from fear. This is not an ending. It is a different beginning, one that does not announce itself, does not seek validation, and does not need to be understood to be lived. When guilt stops working, it is not because you became harder, it is because something in you woke up and refused the old contract. Those who panic are not losing you, they are losing the mechanism that once kept you compliant. Guilt only has power over what still seeks permission. When that permission is withdrawn, the noise fades, and what remains is not conflict, but an unfamiliar calm you no longer need to explain,